Yeah.
Great. With that, I'll open it to the attendees then. So we can give them a few moments to get logged in. We're up to 10 attendees already, so we'll give them a few moments, and then I'll hand it over to Christian Forstner.
What's the exact time now?
It's 10:01.
Okay, so 1 more minute. Okay. But Frank, I'll keep it brief and then hand it over to you.
Yeah.
I could. Yeah. Just open it. Say a few words of introduction.
Yeah.
And then it's all yours.
Okay. Do my best.
Okay, let's get it started. Perfect. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone on behalf of the Hanns-Seidel Foundation and the partnering institutions, the Atlantic Council and panelists to this webinar, The Decline of Energy Prices and what this means for the United States, for Russia, and for international energy policies. It is a very timely debate, and it's a debate which leads us to the core of economies in the US, in Russia, and globally. The importance of the energy sector cannot be highlighted and stressed enough, and we clearly see it when President Donald Trump brokered a deal in April to curb and to cut oil production. That's why we bring in a couple of perspectives: the national perspective, the role of the energy sector and the importance of the energy sector for the national economies; the transatlantic agenda, as energy security figures prominently on the European-American agenda; and the international perspective. So we are happy to have the possibility to dive deeper into these topics. And we couldn't imagine of a better panel than we do have this morning. It is, I'm happy to welcome Randy Bell from the Atlantic Council, the director of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Policy Center. We are happy to have you with us. We have from Moscow zoomed in Vladimir Milov, who is one of the best known energy experts in Russia and in Europe. Vladimir served in the Russian government as deputy energy minister. And Vladimir Milov became extremely famous in, I think it was in 2011, when Vladimir Milov published a report on mismanagement and corruption together with Boris Nemtsov. And all this expertise will be brought in and guided by our expert and moderator from Germany, Dr. Frank Umbach, who is well known in Germany and beyond Germany for his energy expertise. And Frank will lead this discussion for the next 45 minutes. Frank is advising international institutions such as NATO or the European Commission, and works closely with private businesses. So we are happy to have this discussion. So we see it's an international debate, with experts from the US, from Russia, from Germany. And this program is jointly, has been set up with my colleague from the Moscow office, Jan Dresel, who is also available and will wrap up the discussion at the end. So we're happy to have it. To all listeners, please use the Q&A button and function and bring in your questions and your comments, and we will try to save and make time for all your comments and questions. With this, I welcome again everybody and hand it over to you, Frank, and we look forward to a very enlightening discussion. Thank you all for joining this morning to this webinar. Frank.
Hello, good morning, America, so to speak. Here's late afternoon in Central Europe. Let me firstly thank Christian for inviting me and having great pleasure to moderate that kind of panel. And I think we have two excellent experts and speakers. Christian has already introduced those, so I don't have to do it any longer. For me, it's a great pleasure for two reasons. One reason has to do with Vladimir. I think we know each other for more than 15 years. And unfortunately, we haven't seen us during the last years, but I'm always following his publications. And it's of course a second good reason for me, and that's the reason also why I'm maybe feeling like coming back to an old family. Randy Bell, so we don't know each other personally, but I have worked for the Atlantic Council some years ago. So here again, it's a great pleasure for having him in our panel. I think the topic couldn't be more timely, and I think there's even here in Europe maybe an underestimation of the topic and the challenges it brings with, and that has to do that we focus so much on the pandemic that we may overlook a lot of other developments, global developments, and that's always somehow a problem in my own country as well as in the EU. I think the oil price war, which started at the beginning of April and at the end already of March, was highlighting a lot of problems we had already on the global oil market. But the developments then over the next weeks have also highlighted that, from my point of view, there was a kind of strategic failure on the side of the Russian government by underestimating the impact of the global pandemic. And we have seen that maybe a strategic failure also on the side of the Saudis, which may also have underestimated the impact. Then we had a development over time where it led even to negative oil prices in the United States. And a number of experts do not exclude that these negative oil prices may re-emerge over the next months. Globally, I think with the dramatic oil prices going down and with the forecast that we may not recover to the status quo until this year, but maybe next year, I think a lot of oil producing countries facing huge economic financial questions and challenges as the fiscal break-even prices are still beyond, in average, more than $60 per barrel in many of these countries. But of course, I will give at first the floor to Vladimir to ask him how the oil price war, then we had the April agreement, which was widely seen by experts as too little and too late. And then we had a more stronger impact already of the global pandemic on Russia itself. How that is affecting firstly the Russian energy and oil market, but then looking also beyond to which extent Russian energy experts foresee some of those global impacts and challenges the global pandemic brings along with that. And after your 5-minute statement, I will give the floor immediately to Randy Bell, also to look at first to the US markets, where we had already shale oil industry somehow struggling even before the outbreak of the pandemic, and then also looking to the potential global impact. So please, the floor is yours, Vladimir.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's good to see you after all these years, and it's great talking to all of you. There's so much to say in 5 minutes, but I'll just run through some brief bullet points. First, the impact of the current situation. You have to understand that there are two very different impacts. First, on the oil industry itself, which I think is going rather well through all these difficulties despite the plunging oil prices. And second, the greater impact of the collapse in the oil prices on the Russian economy, and particularly the state budget. The thing is that a Russian taxation system in the oil industry is built that way. So when the oil prices go down, level of taxation, which are obviously linked with the international oil price, they immediately go down with some lag time, but nonetheless, it is the budget, state budget, which suffers the most. The oil companies are in a relatively good shape because they have generally, we're not talking some marginal volumes of production at new remote fields, but the bulk, which is still produced in areas like Western Siberia or Timano-Pechora or Urals-Volga region, that's still fairly cost competitive. For instance, Rosneft, the biggest oil company, has just released its IFRS financial report for the first quarter, and you can see that the average lifting costs on a wellhead of producing oil is below $3 a barrel, and average cost of pipeline shipment to the port is $5 per barrel. So it's well below 10 bucks altogether, oil loaded to tankers in the port, which means that like in April, according to Minfin, we had an average $18 price of Urals. That's still fairly profitable. And despite plunging prices in the first quarter, Rosneft had shown good operational profits. They still reported losses, but largely because of the financial management. They had well over $1 billion operational profit and about $2.something billion free cash flow. So bottom line, Russian oil companies are pretty good in terms of being equipped to crises like that. Moreover, a lot of us remember the events of 1998, 22 years ago, when we had a collapse of export prices below $10 per barrel. I was in the government at the time, and many of the top managers of the oil companies, like Lukoil, Surgutneftegaz, they were there, so they have a fairly good experience of how to manage this type of a crisis. So I'd say oil industry, of course, it is hit hard, but it will survive. It will get through, and this is not something which is particularly destructive, and really, they are, in fact, the bulk of their production is cost competitive. Bigger problems are connected with the state budget, because obviously oil and gas deliver a bulk of revenue, but still government was preparing for this war. This is why they have been so crazy accumulating all these financial reserves. The National Wealth Fund is currently about 13% of the Russian GDP. So they actually plan to spend it on financing the budget deficit. They are considering to have a deficit of 4 to 6% of GDP this year, according to various government estimates. They will gradually spend the National Wealth Fund, but the finance minister Siluanov had said that there will be still some money left until 2024 in the National Wealth Fund, while it being gradually spent on funding the yearly deficits. So, but still, I have to say that there is the big question on how the economy will move forward, because it was more and more reliant on state intervention and financing of so-called national projects, which were supposed to sustain economic growth. Obviously, the national projects idea is dead by now, because there's no extra money. They will have to spend it one way or another to financing huge deficits. So the crisis is a bigger question to the government's finances and the whole model of economic development, rather than to the oil industry. Oil industry will be like more or less fine, but the government economic policy is in big trouble. And the last thing I wanted to say is about Russia's relations with OPEC. There's been much talk about the price war, which had broken out in March. What I have been saying all along during all these 3 years of the previous Russia-OPEC agreement, while it was in force, that essentially they're simply buying themselves time, but it cannot enable neither OPEC nor Russia to escape the global oversupply crisis. They might as well delay it, but the oversupply crisis was there for years, and they just, I mean, they kept the prices above $60 for a couple of years. But we already saw last year in 2019 a quite significant decrease in the oil prices while the OPEC-Russia deal was still in effect. So I think this is why Russia walked out so easily, because they probably miscalculated on timing, but they saw no point keeping the agreement further, because in January, February, the oil prices continued to collapse. Brent had plunged from like something like $70 per barrel in the end of the year to less than 50 in February, which I think had added a lot to Russian motivation. What about the current deal? Actually, I don't believe that Russian companies will significantly cut production as promised. We already almost in the end of May. There is still no physical evidence on the ground that they are shutting down fields or even wells. Moreover, in this presentation to the IFRS first quarter report, Rosneft has said openly that they do not plan well shut-ins. They do not plan to shut down oil wells. They say they use the vague formula that we're going to manage the flow from operating wells, but we're not going to do any shutdowns, which doesn't sound too serious to me. I think we're going to come back to the good old story of Russia cheating on OPEC agreement and Saudis getting mad about it. Believe me, we'll see this a few weeks down the road. So, and there is no credible statistics also. We can discuss this further. So this will allow cheating to last for some time. But I do not see any real serious efforts, because Russia had committed itself to a massive shutdown of production, but nothing of that sort is really happening on the ground. We don't see any specifics, which fields, which wells will be closed. Yeah. So actually, I don't believe that this agreement will be particularly effective, and I don't see that Russia is fulfilling it. So I expect more trouble between Russia and OPEC further down the road. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think there's a lot of food for thought as well as for the discussion we will have, and we will certainly come back to one or another point you have made, and maybe to some others. I would immediately give the floor also to Randolph. Please, it's yours. And looking forward, how the US market has been impacted, as well as take a more global view, how you see the global oil industry or the oil producing countries may have to cope with political, economic, social instabilities, particularly when the oil crisis and the oversupply, as we all believe, will last longer than maybe some of us have believed just a few weeks ago. Please.
Thank you. Frank, thank you, and thank you to Hanns-Seidel for inviting me here. And Vladimir, it's an honor to be on a panel with you. You are a legend. And my colleague, Anders Åslund, asked me to pass on my best to you. So best from Anders. I have 3 points that I'll raise right now, and then we can get into more details. First is on the oil price war. And I think it's just important to note that really no one won that price war, simply mostly because of the unprecedented demand destruction that we've seen. But I do think it's worth assessing who lost less badly. So, and from my view of it, Russia came out on the bottom. They were forced to come back to the table, making a 2.5 million barrel a day cut, though, again, Vladimir, your point making that they may be cheating, though I'd love to talk to you about some reporting that I saw earlier this week that Russia's actually getting close to its stated target of 8.5 million barrels a day total production. It was something like 8.7 or 8.8. But they had balked at 300,000 barrels a day cut in May. So in the meantime, they've lost market share in Europe, to Saudi, to the UAE, and just recently last week, they lost market share to the US, even though those volumes are small. I think that's symbolically important. So I think it's fair to say that Saudi beat Russia in this head-to-head match. And of course, that had significant assists from the US intervening, from Fatih Birol playing an important behind-the-scenes role, and obviously the dramatic demand destruction, which really ultimately forced everyone's hand. But for the Saudis, and I think this is important for the global picture, the victory may have been a Pyrrhic one, as it hurt the already suffering US-Saudi relationship. Now, Saudi, during the price war, was rightfully insisting that it wasn't taking aim at US shale, but engaging in a short-term tactic to go after Russia and get Russia back to the table. Now, Russia was very publicly saying it was taking an aim at US shale. Now, Saudi is invested in the US, they're invested in shale, and at the very least, they learned their lesson from 2014 to 2016 that ultimately you just can't beat shale at its own game. It's short cycle. The US has a lot of capital willing to go into shale, even if that is being perhaps prior to the price war drawn back a little bit. There was still a lot of opportunity, and I think that Dan Jurgen put it correctly that rocks don't go bankrupt. So ultimately, all that resource is there and can be developed can and would be developed when the price is right. But nonetheless, in the U.S., a lot of the interpretation was that this is Saudi's fault. Why is that? There's tremendous lingering anti-OPEC sentiment from the oil shocks of the 70s and 80s. Just in general, people in Congress are ready to blame Saudi no matter what. And finally, I think perhaps even most importantly, the U.S. probably had more leverage over Saudi than it had over Russia. Whether you're talking about the security umbrella, whether you're talking about Donald Trump making sort of being the last bulwark of support for Saudi in the United States with a Congress that's increasingly skeptical, there was a lot more it could do. Now, there was some talk in April about the U.S. offering some carrots to Russia, but there's enough anti-Russia that just wasn't possible. There really wasn't anything the U.S. could do for Russia. So I think ultimately the U.S. probably edged out Saudi and Russia in this price war because it didn't need to commit any cuts to get OPEC Plus to act. However, the U.S. industry is a mess. You see the small and medium players in pretty bad shape. The majors are actually in well positioned and are going to weather this pretty well. But sort of the core of the U.S. industry, what we think about innovative, scrappy small players who are much of Donald Trump's base, frankly, are in trouble. And the U.S. political system can't figure out what to do about it. And so the U.S. is struggling that way. And it also became very clear in a very public way what we have all known for a while, that U.S. production free rides on the back of OPEC market management. I'm just not sure how good a look it is for the U.S. president to get on the phone with Saudi and Russia and essentially beg them to save what I think is a U.S. strategic industry. So for now, the U.S. remains the largest producer globally because its so-called organic cuts will take longer to come off the market than the more decisive actions by the OPEC Plus group. Of course, Russia always being a question. But the IEA is projecting the U.S. will ultimately take the largest cuts by the end of the year. So, but we'll see because prices are rebounding a little bit and U.S. shale continues to drive efficiencies in production. So this leads to what I think is important about sort of the energy dominance agenda and the difficulty in the U.S. in taking any action, because there's a political paradox here with oil production decline and suffering low oil prices. Low oil prices have previously been seen as a net benefit for the U.S. economy and good for the U.S. consumer, but now with the U.S. as a net exporter, though unclear if it will remain so, and oil and gas investment representing a significant portion of business fixed investment. This is actually a net negative for the U.S. economy. And this is particularly true in the current environment now that consumers are driving much less and are not seeing any of the benefits of cheap gasoline. But so the net negative piece, unfortunately, is highly localized. It's not evenly distributed across the country. So you see it in the shale patch, Texas, Western Pennsylvania, North Dakota. And so it's harder to act from a political perspective, given that the industry really has only the full-throated support of a dozen or so senators. So you'll see as the economy in the U.S. begins to reopen, the appeal of low gasoline prices is going to matter more. So what you're stuck with is this problem where you have individual voters who want low gasoline prices across the country, particularly now that the economy is suffering. But the paradox is that they want the overall economy to get better, which would benefit from a strong oil and gas industry. Now, you add on top of that how strong U.S. oil and gas sector provides foreign policy benefits, and you begin to understand some of the contradictions and the inaction of the U.S. as it was trying to manage this crisis through March and April. You just don't know what to do because you have countervailing impulses. Now, finally, I want to talk just a brief point on the future of oil demand. First, we don't know the pace of economic recovery. There will be a second wave of COVID, et cetera, and that's going to be what's important for the short term for the rest of the year. But even beyond COVID, I think there's a lot of variables at play that it's just impossible to know where we're going to end up on oil demand. And so that'll have vastly different repercussions. I like to think in terms of scenarios, which are really caricatures of what's possible that might possibly happen. So I have three scenarios. So one, an early peak in oil demand, where changes in consumer behavior combined with serious climate action, like the kinds like you're seeing discussed in Europe, mean that oil demand never really fully recovers from the shock of COVID-19 and begins to decline much sooner than most of those other previous peak oil demand models predicted. Next scenario, return to status quo ante, where we actually don't see that much structural change in the economy. Once we sort of go back to normal, everybody's sort of exhausted. You just try to get back to where we were. So it takes a while to clear oil inventories. Price remains low in the short term, but the eventual increase in demand tied with a lack of upstream investment pushes oil price back up in a few years. And then finally, I see a sort of opposite of the first scenario, I like to call oily world, where in the name of economic growth, countries abandon their climate commitments, double down on cheap hydrocarbons, and consumer behavior, such as driving more instead of taking public transportation, supports more oil demand. There are a number of key drivers to look at that have countervailing influences: consumer behavior, driving. Will the fear of public transport encourage more personal car use, or will that be offset by more people working from home? We just don't know yet. Air travel, will people ever fly again like they used to? Or will we simply go to meetings through Zoom? And I have a feeling that we're going to be doing many more meetings through Zoom, even when this is all over. Single-use plastic, will concerns about cleanliness of reusable dishware shift to and more restaurant takeout stall the movement against single-use plastic? I worry about global trade. Will worries about supply chain risk encourage more localization of production? And so seeing decreased oil consumption in the maritime sector. And then finally, I think it's really worth thinking about climate policy. And if COVID-19 will accelerate government-driven climate action through green stimulus, or on the other hand, will the abundance of cheap hydrocarbons encourage countries to forego their climate ambitions in the name of a rapid recovery? I think this is going to vary by jurisdiction, and so we'll have to see how it balances out. But the one sort of wild card in all that is, I think, the European carbon border adjustment, which, if implemented, could actually start setting global norms for CO2, and could have impacts well beyond the EU. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Frank, and let's have a great discussion.
Yeah, many thanks. I think also your three scenarios brings me to one of the major questions I wanted to ask Vladimir. But you made the point rightly that the Russian oil industry may cope with the present situation. But looking ahead, one of the fundamental challenges Russia is facing is that the diversification of the economy, despite all promises Putin made even in the early days of when he became president, did not move really forward. So 60% of the Russian exports are still based on oil and gas. And looking ahead to an early demand scenario, and where climate policy may have a larger impact on the oil and gas industry worldwide, and then looking to Russia's new energy strategy, just being after many years of competing discussions, being just signed, there is no reference at all to renewables and to the climate policies and the climate agenda. So I'm wondering really whether Russia is still living more or less in the past or in the present days, but has no clue, no strategic perspective for an alternative scenario where the global oil and gas demand will decline much earlier than even we think here in the West. So I was wondering whether there's any kind of discussion on the Russian side, particularly also in regard that the oil export policy is still based on the old oil reserves and fields, which are depleting very rapidly. And we have for some years a discussion already that Russia needs U.S. Oil companies, technology, and management expertise, particularly also for developing its huge, potentially huge, unconventional oil fields. So here we're running in various directions, where I see Vladimir's point how well the oil industry is doing today, but when I'm looking ahead strategically, I'm even more worried about the lack of vision and strategic objectives in this respect. Vladimir, very short.
Of course, it's the most important issue right now, because what we're seeing is the hydrocarbon model of economic development actually going bankrupt, even as we speak. And there is simply no alternative, because you rightly said that despite all this rhetoric over many years that we need to diversify away from hydrocarbon dependence, we still, judging by such criteria as a share of oil and gas revenue in the federal budget, or a share of oil and gas in Russian exports, we're far worse than we were 20 years ago. The dependence right now grew bigger. And there is obviously simply no alternative, because we are one of the worst countries in the world, for instance, in terms of share of renewables in our energy mix. It's like 0.0 point something percentage point and so on. And we have just a few installations, mostly experimental. So yeah, we were talking about diversification under Putin for many years, but doing nothing because everybody was simply busy counting the oil money. So no time left, no stimulus. What's more important, no stimulus left to do something to diversify. Moreover, there's been a very dangerous shift in policy thinking in the recent years, that we need to diversify the economy by using this oil money in the first place to build the so-called national projects and so on. So everybody was again busy with redistribution of the oil revenue, rather than really creating some new type of economy. I think we're facing a moment of truth right now. Under Putin, there is no easy way out of it, because these folks in government, they really are not capable of much else except redistributing the oil money. So we will be, the forecast is obvious, the economy will be in a tight spot for the coming years, because there will be no super profits anymore. As we enjoyed in the previous years, even under $60 per barrel, we still had some super profits coming in. Not anymore, and this will last for several years ahead. So economy is in a tight spot. When I was saying that oil companies are coping, I meant that they will be making some profits, but there will be not much to share with the rest of the country. So yeah, that's a huge challenge under system that Putin has built, mainly focused on redistribution of the oil revenue. There is no way out. We need to build something completely different. I reckon it will be associated with a greater call for a political change, but that's another topic.
Okay, short question also to Randolph. I think the Trump administration, understandably, is very much engaged in rescuing the U.S. oil industry, no doubt. But also looking ahead, in your scenario, maybe with an early oil demand, could you imagine where the present pandemic maybe also lasting longer, and with a scenario of an early demand forecasting, maybe may this lead to some kind of changes on the Trump government side at a time where globally, at the moment, only the renewables will still increase their share in the global energy mix. Yeah, and even in the US, when I'm following the situation with the coal industry, the nuclear industry losing ground, so does this may lead to some kind of a major changes, rethinking on the Trump administration, also looking more strategically ahead, and developing a more favorable policy also for renewables, not against the oil industry, but alongside to make clear there needs to be a different kind of scenario, strategic economic path. Also for the US oil and gas industry. One of the examples here in Europe is there's a huge hype, as you may know, a huge hype on hydrogen, sometimes for me too much, yeah, but at least that gives the oil and gas industry some kind of an alternative economic development and future. So do you think that something could emerge on the US side too?
Yeah, so this trend is actually, was actually happening even before COVID, where you were starting to see the Trump administration and President Trump himself stop the sort of climate denial, the bashing of renewables. Now, President Trump doesn't like offshore wind for very particular reasons, but in fact, his administration has been fairly supportive of offshore wind. And we hosted an advisor to Department of Interior a while back, and he said he had come back from Denmark, where he had seen guys in hard hats building offshore wind turbines, and it clicked for him that these are jobs of the future, and that we have an opportunity to build. And the Trump administration is really into building, and really and so clean energy as a whole does have constituencies within the Trump administration as a sort of construction project, as a building of the United States project. At the same time, there really is in Congress a growing movement. It's quiet, but you're starting to see it bubble up, that the Republican Party does need to engage on climate change. There's a recognition that by the leadership in the House, that they probably won't be able to retake the House without some sort of climate policy, simply because younger people are far more engaged on climate and climate action than some of the older generations. And as more and more young people turn 18 and start voting, they really do need to engage. I was on a webinar 2 weeks ago with Exim, the US Exim Bank, which has recently been reauthorized, where Kim Reed, the chair of the bank, was talking about renewables and said, climate change is a challenge, and US renewable exports can help other countries meet that challenge. So this trend has been ongoing. So it's a very different administration on renewables and climate than it was when President Trump was elected. I do think COVID is going to accelerate that, because you're already seeing many of the oil majors, particularly the European majors, they're cutting back on oil, but they're not cutting back nearly as much on their investments in renewables. And you even see the U.S. majors who are while they're less forward-leaning than the European majors, they are investing in renewables. They're investing in clean energy technologies. It's going to have a different flavor than it would if Trump is reelected. It's going to have a different flavor than it would, say, under a Biden administration, and Biden could go different pathways depending on sort of who his advisors are. There's going to be much more emphasis on carbon capture, on hydrogen, on methane, lowering the carbon footprint of hydrocarbons, and less on the sort of keep it in the ground mentality that you see from some in the left. But yes, I do think that you are seeing climate action starting to emerge from the Republican.
Okay, I got your point. Yeah, I wanted to give the floor to Christian Plank. I think he may have some questions from the audience to you. Please, Christian.
Right, thank you. So we have a question here from Jim Kolb, and this is speaking a little more in a different direction towards China. So he says, interesting that China hasn't been mentioned in this discussion so far. As the largest importer of oil, what options do they have in the looming trade war with the US of manipulating the energy markets to advantage them and disadvantage the US?
So there was, in the past month, maybe month and a half, the date is escaping me at the moment, the first shipment of US LNG to China in over a year. And China has made a number of promises to buy US energy. And so that's really where China has leverage, is on the purchase of US energy. As the largest importer, they very much could, as part of a negotiation, purchase more US energy. If these tensions continue to heat up, ultimately the U.S. energy industry could suffer, because there's so much oil, there's so much gas right now that they really just have options. And so as a producer looking for markets, the U.S. really is, I think, at a disadvantage there. And what the U.S. doesn't have that say Saudi or Russia has is ability at the national level to set price. And so, for instance, just if you look at the U.S. sale of oil to Romania that was announced not Romania, Belarus last week, there was the volumes were very, very small, and it was very symbolic, simply because the U.S. couldn't set the price. This was a market price, and U.S. government was involved. Pompeo was involved. They made an announcement. They made hay of it. But ultimately, the U.S. can't set prices like you can if you're Saudi, where you say, we're going to set the price for X for this market for the month. And so we don't have that same amount of selling power at a national level that our competitors do have.
Okay, Christian, any further questions?
Right, we have another question here from Jens Strohschneider. So, additional question to Vladimir in connection to China. Will Russia be able to monetize its Power of Siberia pipeline to China, or raise export volumes to China?
I don't think so, because Power of Siberia is a very localized story. It is not connected to the major gas-producing fields. The resource base are only two very remote fields in eastern Siberia and Yakutia and Irkutsk Oblast, Chuinda and Kavykta, which are only connected to this pipeline, and there is no other source. Now, recent reports that we had from people who actually work on those fields, the former employees of Gazprom production Noyabrsk, which is developing those, these people are actually saying that because of the lack of geological information at the time when these fields began to be developed, and because of some faults during drilling and development, these fields will probably not be able to actually deliver even the relatively limited volume that is intended to be supplied to China under the Power of Siberia contract. Now, just to give you some figures, the total peak number of supplies through Power of Siberia is 38 BCM per year. But this seems, given all the information that we receive from the upstream in Yakutia and Irkutsk, this seems probably not achievable. But the good news for Gazprom is that this contract envisages only a gradual schedule of reaching that peak. In the coming years, they will supply just a few BCM a year. So we're not really talking about big volumes here. We're not talking about major monetization. And they began supplies in December, so we already have the data about the actual price of gas sales to China as reported by the Federal Customs. So it's just a little over $200 per 1,000 cubic meters, which is next to nothing. I wonder if they make profits at that level of a price, because Power of Siberia is an extremely expensive project. There's nothing compared to the depreciated European pipelines which existed since the Soviet era. So I'm not certain that they make profit right now selling gas to China under $200. And they still have problems at the upstream end with delivering sufficient outputs. There's been a lot of reports that they have overestimated those fields, that they might not deliver the necessary volume. So Power of Siberia is a fairly small, very localized project, which is in a lot of trouble on both ends, the upstream end and the purchase price end. So I don't think you should really take into your optics as some real major development which can deliver some good revenue to Russia.
Okay. Christian, do we have some minutes, or do we have already to wrap up our webinar?
We do have one question left, and then I think we'll wrap up after that. Okay. And this question has to do with domestic politics in Russia. And this is asking what level of oil prices will lead to Putin's default of the political system and turning the people against basically what is currently the system in place.
Look, this is a complicated story. Strong authoritarian regimes like that just do not fall overnight. And we're not talking about some specific level of price, because Putin has been developing a system of defending his power under all kinds of possible siege, including the economic collapse like we see today. So it will be a very gradual story, with more and more society realizing that this government is inadequate and we need political changes. I think we are entering the phase when Putin will be openly politically challenged, when essentially the country reopens after a COVID pandemic. Because we are right now in a situation when Putin's approval rating are at historic lows. Public discontent with how government is handling all that is happening is at record highs instead. So there will be open political questioning of the authorities by the society after Russia reopens. But I strongly warn against driving too fast of a conclusion about Putin's fate, because he's prepared to defend himself. So it will be some sort of a standoff, might last for some time, might also be very disturbing and even bloody. So let's see what awaits us down the road. But I think Putin right now is in the biggest political trouble since his ascent to power 20 years ago.
Great. As I don't have to wrap up the session, which will be done, and I will give the floor immediately to Jan Peso, the representative of the Hanns-Seidel Foundation in Moscow. Let me say, just from my side already, I would thank the Hanns-Seidel Foundation for this great webinar. I would thank Vladimir and Randolph for the great statements and the discussions. And I think even we could not raise all the issues or go in more details. I think we touched so many fascinating dimensions which we could ongoing discuss for over the next days, I think. And we will certainly come back in one or another way via publications or via another webinar on those issues. From my side, I believe the global pandemic will last longer, and the economic effects may last longer. And so the impact on the oil and gas industry will also be more fundamental, as we may even estimate today. So in this respect, the ammunition will not go away for further discussions. But again, I think I have forgotten to welcome Jan Peso at the beginning of our webinar. We had a pleasure to have a longer telephone discussion this morning. Again, welcome, Jan, and I'm glad that you will wrap up somehow our so many fascinating issues we raised in our very short time of discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Frank. First of all, I'd like to say I just got a cup of tea because I would like to listen to you guys for another 2 or 3 hours. So I got prepared to that, but unfortunately our time is already over. I would like to thank, first of all, the three of you, our three experts. Let me start, as I'm the representative of Hanns-Seidel Foundation in Russia. Let me first thank Vladimir Milov. We are very, very pleased to have you here today, and we will certainly have a chance to cooperate also in the future to have you at our events. Thank you very much to you. Thank you for Randolph Bell for a very, very interesting US perspective on the global issues, so about the developments all over the world. Thanks to you, Frank, for the great moderation of our webinar. You just said we had an introductory talk this morning. We hadn't known each other before. It was very interesting, and I'm absolutely sure that we will, all three of us, will keep in touch in some way. And I'd also like to mention that one of the positive effects of this current situation we are all suffering from is that we can have a US expert during our discussion, because usually We have rather people from Europe and Russia at our events. Our Russian office organizes. So this is a unique chance, I think, and I'm very, very glad. This was our premiere for Moscow, at least, and I'd like to thank you once again, all three of you. I'd like to thank, of course, also all our participants, everybody who registered and participated in this seminar. Also for your very good questions you asked. I also think I saw, I had a short look at who joined us today. I think it's quite a mixed community we have today from the US, from Russia, from Europe, also from Western Europe, from all different countries. I think also some people from other European countries, France and so on. So I'm very, very glad that all of you were with us. And of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank my colleagues in Washington, Christian Forstner and Christian Blank, who did a great job. You noticed they were responsible not only for the contents as we were, but also for the technical parts. So thanks so much also to you. I'd like to ask our participants of today's webinar, if you want to leave feedback. Of course, we always, as a political foundation, need to report on what we're doing. And if you give us written feedback, that would be, of course, of great advantage to us. That would be great. And I also hope we see some of you, especially those who are from Russia, of course, at our future events, not only at the webinars, but hopefully we'll be able to do seminars and meet again, and at some point maybe also shake hands again. That's what I wish for. And I think it's been a hard test for all of us the last few weeks, but I'm absolutely sure that we will not only lose, but we will also gain a lot from this crisis. And we will certainly offer our Washington office, but also our Moscow office, more webinars, more online events. And of course, all of you are more than welcome, also our three experts, to join them. And yeah, in this sense, I'd like to wish all of you a good afternoon. In Germany, it's Vatertag today, so it's Father's Day. So it's a very special holiday. It's even a holiday for religious reasons, but all the dads got a very nice surprise, or many dads got a very nice surprise this morning, including me. So enjoy the rest of the day. All the best, and thanks again to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.